All right, you ready, AJ?
Aye, copy job.
Okay. This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at javascriptjabber.com/KendoUI. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have AJ O'Neill.
Yo, coming at you live from Provo, Utah.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Johannes Schickling.
Hey everybody, excited to be here again.
Yeah, it's been a while. I think last time we talked about GraphCool, and then I think we may have talked about Prisma at some point on Adventures in Angular. But you've had some pretty exciting stuff go on this year.
Yeah, for sure. It has been quite busy last half a year for us, with plenty of launches, plenty of announcements, and lots of great feedback from the community. So I'm happy to share a bit more like the behind the scenes and like what's happened for us over the last couple of months.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk really briefly about the seed round that you raised, and then we can go back and we can talk about GraphCool and morphing into Prisma and what you're working on now. Does that sound like a good progression?
For sure.
So let's dive in. So you guys raised a seed round. You were actually doing the press stuff when we were scheduled to record last week, so we rescheduled. Do you want to just fill us in on what's going on with that and how that went?
For sure. And thanks again for being so flexible on the scheduling. Last Tuesday actually, and today is like Monday, May 21st. So last Tuesday on the 15th, we had our big announcement. Two big announcements actually. Like first, that we are rebranding from GraphCool into Prisma, and also that we've announced our seed round. So we've raised $4.5 million from some pretty good investors based here in San Francisco. So our seed round was led by Kleiner Perkins, which some of you might know. And we have a couple of other really great investors on board of related, very relevant companies. So we have the founder and CEO of Algolia. We have the founder of Site, Guillermo Rauch. We have the founder of Kong, and various other very interesting people on board that help us with their experience, and also just building the new kind of stack of software and development tools for the next decade. So we're super excited to have brought everybody together there.
Cool. So what are you hoping to do with the seed money?
That's mostly to grow the team. So right now, as we're speaking, we're 9 people. Towards the end of this year, we're almost going to double the team. And grow really like different functions of the team, whether it's marketing to keep our docs up to date. Obviously, we're going to build a lot of database connectors, so we just need a lot of engineering capacity to build all of this software. Also to help with evangelizing, we're looking to hire dev advocates. And just also as growing a company, there, it's not just like programming, but like building a company is just like requires a lot of work. So also non-engineering roles that we're bringing on, and yeah, that's where most of the money is going to, really.
Awesome. And all that work goes into making GraphQL and data layer stuff easier to do, right?
Exactly. So this is where we just see like a huge opportunity and a huge change in the way how people build software, more specifically about build client-server communication, service-to-service communication, and GraphQL just plays such an important role in that we think that we can provide so much value by building Prisma as a common data access layer that people can use in their own applications, that we are willing to put in a lot of work there. So maybe I can also at a later point and throughout this podcast speak a bit more about like what that specifically means and how that provides value to developers. Since I think that's maybe not super straightforward when hearing the term data layer in the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, why don't we talk about what Prisma is?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there are various ways to skin this cat. So one way would be, as you want to build, as a developer, as you want to adopt GraphQL, there are two parts that you need to do. On the one hand, as you're building a React app or whatever front-end framework you're using, you want to consume a GraphQL API. So you're using maybe Apollo client, maybe Relay. So there's that front-end facing part of GraphQL. But to make use of that, you also need a GraphQL server. So there, like, as everybody who wants to adopt GraphQL, you're gonna be you'll face the scenario that you need to build the GraphQL server, and this is where various parts of work are ahead of you. And one of the most significant amount of work is really like this mapping from your API, from your resolvers to a data source, and most often that means connecting an API to your database. And this is basically where Prisma comes in. We want to make that significantly easier for you to build a GraphQL server talking to a database. So that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is like if you're building a backend system, and especially if it grows bigger, then you're thinking about your backend architecture sort of in layers, right? So typically you have your database layer, and then you have your entire backend server layer, and that's also split up into various parts. And so if you're thinking back, maybe like you have a MVC pattern where you have controllers, models, and views. And if in most systems, that's a bit simplified into a database layer, into a API logic layer, and sitting in between, you have a data access layer. And often that is simply a ORM. And as you progress along, and as you scale up your applications, most ORMs don't really hold for all the requirements, all the real world requirements of large scale applications. So they don't perform well, or you hit certain flexibility limitations for the API that you're building. So you're building your own custom data access layer, mostly by still writing manual SQL queries. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the part that we are replacing with Prisma by giving you a really performant and flexible data access layer through the power of GraphQL.
That makes sense. I mean, I've had to build some GraphQL backends. I don't know if you've done this yet, AJ. Have you done a lot with GraphQL on the back end or mostly on the front end?
No, I haven't messed with it other than just looking at a couple of the examples and stuff. And I think the idea is really cool.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background on what I've done, I've played with basically Ruby and Ruby on Rails, and then used the gem to build those systems. And what you wind up doing is you wind up writing these reducers, like Johannes said, you tell it, okay, go do this lookup. When they ask for this data, do this lookup. And when they ask for this data, do that lookup. And some of it's pretty natural from the standpoint of the ORM, and some of it really isn't. And some of it's kind of a pain, and some of it's really a pain. And so, the idea behind Prisma, where it's, hey, look, we'll just work off of the database and, give you something that you can kind of wrap up in the rest of your GraphQL API, is something that really appeals to me, because they'll do a lot of this work and they can actually look at the database and make recommendations.
Exactly. So, little nitpick here on terminology. Maybe it's called reducer in Ruby, but I think you're referring to resolver functions.
Resolver, yes, you're right. They call them resolvers in the gem.
Right. So, and maybe one more thing to add there for the listeners, since one thing that we're seeing from a lot of people who are looking at Prisma is like that they not immediately understand why you would want to use Prisma. And I think that this is where we can really divide developers into two groups, like one group that has already tried to build a GraphQL server and the other group who hasn't. And I think it's for the group who hasn't built a GraphQL server yet, that these people I would really encourage to try to build a GraphQL server themselves, since then the value of Prisma gets very, very apparent, where there are like so many little things that you have to do yourself, especially when you think about implementing that data access in a very efficient way. So there's like this concept of a data loader, and thinking about how you do all of that efficiently and scale it out. This is where Prisma gives you a really nice layer of abstraction that just allows you to frankly like delete code and keep you focused on building the business logic, and helps you to expose the schema that you want, while letting Prisma do the heavy lifting of resolving the data from your database. So I think that's really like what we've seen so far. The people where it clicks the most for are the people who've already tried to build their own GraphQL server and implementing all of these resolvers and trying to make that efficient. So that's quite exciting for us.
Yeah, it was a pain for me. So just.
So I think it gets especially interesting when you're working with multiple databases. Since I think in today's stack, maybe as you're building a smaller application, you're still sticking with like a Postgres database or Mongo database. But as you're building out larger applications and as you're scaling out your, as you put it into production and you have to scale out, this is where you really run into situations where you have to pick various kinds of specialized databases that allow you to give you certain query characteristics and certain performance characteristics. So this is the moment where you start to compose multiple kinds of databases. So where you want to use MongoDB and additionally maybe Elasticsearch, and additionally you would use Redis. And this is what makes implementing that GraphQL server or any sort of server even more complicated, because you have to think, okay, where does my data live? You have certain query languages for all these different kinds of databases. And this is what we're going after with Prisma, that we see, okay, in today's backends are very often composed out of multiple databases, multiple data backends. How can we provide one query abstraction layer across all of these data sources, that you can use GraphQL to resolve data across all of these data sources in one query, and we make sure that it's resolved efficiently.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense just from the performance standpoint. I'm also wondering, though, I mean, I've worked on systems that had multiple back-end databases. So can you point Prisma at more than one at a time and make it work?
Right. So not yet. So right now, so that maybe gives it also a bit more insight into our product roadmap. So right now, Prisma supports two databases, MySQL and Postgres. We'll shortly also add support for MongoDB, and shortly after for Elasticsearch and various other kinds of databases. So the first phase for us is really like implementing access and implementing connectors to various different kinds of databases. And in a second phase, we will implement the possibility that you can use multiple databases together. So that's something that's probably coming up for next year.
Right. How do you control access to the GraphQL endpoint that Prisma gives you? Because it seems like, okay, I point it at my database, I set all the things up, and then what, right? People come and they can just access all of my data all the time. Usually I'm hiding data under certain circumstances, and I'm not showing all the data unless you're logged in and things like that. Does Prisma have a mechanism for that?
Okay, so that's a fantastic point. And I think that's actually the biggest misconception that we have about Prisma, that people think, okay, you take Prisma, you put it in front of your database, and then you start using it from React or whatever GraphQL client that you have. This is more like how we build GraphCool. that you have like a backend service that gives you a ready-to-use GraphQL API out of the box. With Prisma, we're taking a different approach there. So with Prisma, we rather want to make it easy for you to build your own GraphQL server by giving you like an abstraction layer and giving you building blocks to make it easier to build your own GraphQL server. So you wouldn't use Prisma directly from the client, but you would rather talk to Prisma from your own GraphQL server. You're still building your own GraphQL server that you're talking to from the client, but the way how you build your GraphQL server is a lot simpler. And this is where like access control, like any kind of business logic that you would have, you're building in your GraphQL server. So authentication, authorization, any sort of business logic. And then you're using GraphQL bindings to sort of wire up your GraphQL API to Prisma's GraphQL API. So, and this is where like, this sort of wiring you would do using GraphQL bindings, where you use schema stitching under the hood. And this allows you to define the kind of schema that your application should have and can map it to Prisma's auto-generated GraphQL API.
That makes a lot of sense. And I believe I asked that same question and already had the answer from our episode on Adventures in Angular, but I couldn't figure out how to ask how to get you to explain that without being more confusing. So, but yeah, I really love that idea. So then how do I go about merging, say, the Prisma setup with any other setup that I have for my own GraphQL endpoints and, the different parts that I've built into my own application? I keep wanting to say reducers, and I know that that's not right, but the back-end pieces that translate.
Resolvers, yeah.
Resolvers, yeah. So how do I blend my own resolvers then with Prisma?
Right. So all of this is like super flexible and a very elegant solution that GraphQL offers to you. Like it's basically just leverage how you build your own GraphQL server. So on a high level, for people who are not familiar with how you build a GraphQL server, you basically have to do two things. First, you have to define what does your schema look like. So defining your schema, basically like, as you already know, like how you would define a schema for a database, it's very similar, but you define a schema for your application. So that basically means you're defining type definition. So you say a user has a name, which is of type string, and has like an age, which is of type float. And you're just defining like your entire schema for your application. So this is just the structural information. The second part that you have to do is implementing all of these resolver functions. So the resolver functions is basically just a map of functions that the function gets automatically called when a user's name is requested or a user's age is requested. And that's sort of a hierarchical structure that gets executed at the right time to resolve the data that you need. So that is just recapping of like how you build a GraphQL server. So now let's get to the point of how you would have multiple GraphQL APIs, and you basically reuse multiple GraphQL APIs to build your own GraphQL server. That's the entire idea of what's called schema stitching. So it's really like a good analogy is as you have in React, you have React components, and you can define React components by reusing other React components. You can compose React components out of other React components. And you can do the same thing with GraphQL APIs and GraphQL servers. You can basically say, as you have different schemas for different GraphQL endpoints, you can reuse these schemas as you're defining your new GraphQL schema. And in your resolver, now coming to the resolver part, this is where you basically just delegate to another GraphQL API. So this is basically the entire trick of how you minimize the work that you need to do as you build your own GraphQL server. That in your own resolvers, instead of directly resolving the actual data, you just say like, actually, let's just take this other GraphQL API and that takes care of resolving that data, and you just forward the actual resolution. So that's sort of the idea, and that sounds fairly theoretical, but it's actually super easy if you're looking at some code, and that just makes it like super simple to think about your graph, like your servers as like Lego building blocks that you can just snap together. So that allows you really to have, like, for example, Prisma for your own database, but you can also use GitHub's GraphQL API or Yelp's GraphQL API, and just build your own server by recomposing other data and other GraphQL APIs. So that's a really wonderful pattern that's maybe a bit abstract to think about as we're just speaking about it, but it's super easy to get into it, actually.
No, I think it makes sense to me. I mean, you'll have like a top level resolver that's either a Prisma resolver, or you'll have something that you've built as a resolver. And then either way, you can delegate certain parts of your schema to Prisma, or from Prisma back to your own resolvers. And so you can pretty much get whatever you want.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%.
When you start a new project, typically you need things like a domain name, hosting, things like that. When I choose hosting, I pick mine for the options it gives. I like to know what I'm getting and set things up just how I like them. This is why, for your projects, you should check out Linode. Linode servers feature native SSD storage, a 40 gigabyte network, and Intel E5 processors. That's all the power you need to run VMs under full control, or Docker containers, who doesn't love that, encrypted disks, and VPNs. Plus, they have 10 data centers across the world and add-ons like backups, Node Balancer, and Longview to help you control your server costs. They also offer block storage for your static files, and you can get started with a $20 credit if you use the code JavaScript Jabber 2018. That credit is good for 4 months on their 1 gigabyte server. That's a lot of time to try them out and see if they're the right fit for you. That code again is JavaScript Jabber 2018. Also, if you're interested in working for Linode, they're hiring. Head to linode.com/careers to see their available positions. I've kind of been hogging the mic. AJ, do you have some things you want to bring up?
So one thing I'm wondering is, with the roadmap for interfacing with multiple databases, one thing that I don't like about the way databases work is they're inconsistent with their like master-slave options. So with one database, you have to have an exact number of, like, if you're using 2 servers, then you can only use this type of consensus. If you're using 3 or more, you have to use this type of consensus, but you have to have an odd number of servers, or weird things like that. Is there anything to address that type of issue where GraphQL could become an abstraction around just here's a database rather than manage the cluster, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right. So I think I would differentiate here between what it takes to operate a database or like an entire database cluster, and what sort of like on a logical level, what it takes to get from a database. So I think what you touched on first is like just merely the operational angle, what it takes to like scale out the database, and this is where we see like tons of advancement. So I think maybe you've heard about newer kinds of databases like Cockroach DB. These basically allow you to horizontally scale traditional databases like Postgres, or there's TiDB that allows you to do that for MySQL. So this entire operational angle of databases is basically solved for you by new types of databases that still give you the older traditional API that they're used to. You can still use Postgres, you just use this new kind of database engine under the hood that allows you to scale. So the operational part is just being solved for you by newer kinds of databases. What Prisma is rather doing for you is rather helping you to create one abstraction, one universal query language, which GraphQL is like. It enables GraphQL as a universal query language across multiple databases at the same time. Since even though Cockroach allows you to scale a Postgres database, there are still scenarios where you might not just use Postgres, but you also use something like Cassandra or Elasticsearch. And that just makes it a lot harder for you to, in your own server, to talk to all of these at the same time. And that complexity is basically then like implemented in Prisma. So I would really like to sum it up again. I would really differentiate here between the operational angle, what it takes to operate a database, and how today's world looks like in terms of how databases are being split up from a logical perspective. And Prisma helps you a lot with from the logical perspective.
Okay, so with something like Cockroach DB that you just mentioned, since it's already exposing a SQL API, would I be able to use the Postgres adapter with something like that?
Yeah, exactly. That's the entire idea. That's already possible today.
Oh, cool. So that's...
Or Cosmos DB on Microsoft Azure, for example, also implements both MySQL and PostgreSQL. So as long as it's API equivalent, so to speak, you can use it.
Exactly. Cosmos DB is a bit special in that sense because like a multi-model kinds of database, which is another type of database that is just evolving from multiple vendors. But yeah, that's exactly the idea.
So is this something that people can try out now?
Yeah, for sure. So you can basically just go to Prisma.io, click on the docs, and like there are various ways of how you can get started. There's also a fully hosted demo server that comes with a MySQL database that we host for you, just for you to basically get your hands dirty and try it out. And then you can also host this yourself using Docker, using Kubernetes, or you can hosting just works at various providers. You can use Heroku, you can use SiteNow, you can use anything that you want to host this. And super easy to get started.
So is GraphQL itself then going away, or is this just kind of what GraphQL would run on top of?
So Prisma is really the core of what we've developed with GraphQL. So the general idea that we see is we still have a lot of adoption for GraphQL, and that's not going away. So we see a lot of front-end developers mostly looking into GraphQL, that they get a backend up and running really quickly, maybe for prototyping or maybe just for smaller applications that they're building. And what we then see is for the more serious types of applications, this is where you can then take your GraphQL backend and migrate it over to Prisma. That gives you more control and more flexibility as you're building it. So you would rather see that as a two-step process. You're starting out with GraphQL. If it's enough for you, you're sticking with GraphQL. And if you need more flexibility and more control, you'd be using Prisma.
Mm-hmm. So the thing I was going to ask is, do the people that are building this, are they familiar with the what do you call it? Relational algebra? Are they is the GraphQL stuff? Well, or you're not? Are you dealing with the relational algebra stuff at this layer? That's what I want to ask. Or is that all the GraphQL spec, and this is just the resolver pieces?
Right. I think that's a great question. That brings us back to the part about this logical abstraction that Prisma helps you with. Since we think that what you've described with this relational algebra, that's specifically for relational databases, but every different type of database has different ways to look at it. But ultimately, what you really care about is sending a query to that database and getting data back. And we think GraphQL
optimized, which is what you've been talking about too.
Right. So I think there are two ways of in terms of optimization. One is how do you store the data, and one is how do you query the data. And obviously, how you store it influences how you query it. But we can basically provide a different layer of abstraction. That's exactly what Prisma is. So in a typical relational database, you store the data in a very normalized format, which makes it then more difficult to query it again, since you need to join and do all of that. And that's basically what Prisma does for you. You can choose whatever database you want, and therefore whatever efficient way to store and query the data. And Prisma still already lifts it up on that level of abstraction that you actually want in your application, which is typically denormalized. So under the hood, we are managing this relational algebra part for you, not just for querying the data, since Prisma actually also allows you and helps you with migrating your database and defining your data model. So that's exactly the two parts that Prisma helps you with.
So what's Prisma written in? Is it written in JavaScript or is it something else?
Right. We started out with JavaScript and then used Flow for a while, used TypeScript for a while. But since it's really dealing with a lot of complexity and performance was also an important factor for us, we then moved over to rewriting it in Scala. So we've rewritten it in Scala roughly 2 years ago and have been writing it in Scala since then, which has been a pretty good decision for us since it just allows us to cope with complexity in a much better way. And there's also a very interesting development happening recently. Oracle has been working on this project called GraphQL, which basically allows you to compile any sort of JVM-based system, and actually going beyond the JVM as well, but it allows you to take Scala or Java and compile it into native binaries. So that basically allows you to take Prisma and just run it as a binary without needing the JVM.
Oh wow, that would be cool.
Yeah, that's super exciting for us, and I think really shakes up the entire Java ecosystem quite a bit.
Yep. So who should be paying attention to this? I mean, who's going to be listening to this and think, is this for me? And you're going to say, oh, if you're this kind of developer, or you're doing these kinds of things, this is for you.
Right. So I think you should definitely pay attention if you're thinking of adopting GraphQL and you need to build a GraphQL server that talks to either your existing database or you're building a new server from scratch with a new database. That's where Prisma really shines. But more on a bigger picture, like whenever you're actually talking to a database, whether that's through an ORM or directly using SQL queries, this is also where we want to establish Prisma as the default of how you're thinking of interacting with a database. So basically, whenever you have a database involved and you need to talk to that database, that's where Prisma comes in.
Gotcha. So you rebranded the company to Prisma. Is that just to indicate to people that that's your primary focus these days?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And we've taken this step in a couple of smaller steps as well. So we first launched Prisma 1.0 in January this year, and then have really seen how the community embrace Prisma more and more, and that this has really become the focus of the entire community. So the best way for us to show our commitment to Prisma and show this focus is by rebranding. And I think that has worked out really well so far. And I think it's all about sending a coherent message to developers. And that's what a lot of other languages or tools have already done. MongoDB has done the same things a couple of years ago, and we just followed that example.
Yeah, I don't even remember what they were called before MongoDB, though I do remember the rebrand
before.
What was that?
Tenzen.
Tenzen, that's right. So are you aware of anyone using this in production?
Yeah, so we're currently helping a bunch of bigger companies to roll this out in production. There's, for example, a UK company called Lad Bible, which is already using this in production, gets millions of queries on that. And so we expect some bigger blog posts about this in the coming months of bigger companies using Prisma in production. Nice.
Now, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. A lot of times when I pull in third-party systems like Prisma, that need to kind of run alongside my application and do work, I'm always tempted to not test them because I assume that they just work as advertised. Do you recommend that, or do you recommend that people actually test to make sure that the things are getting resolved properly?
So I think, and it's all a matter of maturity, of course. And we're just actually about to introduce a new beta process to make roll out different Prisma features in various maturity stages. But I think that's exactly one of the core promises and core benefits that Prisma provides to you, that it's one abstraction layer that you don't have to question and that you can just rely on. In the same way as you're building a front-end application, you don't need to worry about, oh, does React actually transform my DOM in the right way? And that's exactly how we think about the data access through Prisma. Of course, like Prisma incorporates a ton of different edge cases, and that creates a lot of value, but also we need to make sure that all of these are implemented correctly. So we are writing a ton of tests, and that just means that there sometimes are bugs, but generally we're moving to a world where all of that is just very reliable and rock solid. And so, yeah, I think that's to get back to your question. I think that's a bit of a continuous spectrum where things are just constantly being improved. And if you're rolling out Prisma right now with Postgres or MySQL, you should be in a pretty good state.
So what are the next things you're working on adding? Is it other databases, or are there other features you're working on adding as well?
Right. So that's basically we're thinking there in 3 dimensions. So one, it's about adding support for more databases. Second, it's about solidifying the core that we already do have. So there are a couple of features that we have not yet implemented. For example, polymorphic relations or various other types of data access that just make it easier for you to work with data around aggregations and similar things. And the third part is just the adjacent tooling ecosystem. So for example, right now to use Prisma, the easiest way to do that is in the Node ecosystem. But we see so much demand in the Go ecosystem, in the Java ecosystem, the Ruby ecosystem. So it's really a high priority for us to bring support, to build out the necessary GraphQL tooling in these other language communities as well. So these are the 3 focus areas for us.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks then. Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. All right, so I'm going to do a couple of picks. One of my picks is Audible, audible.com. I'm sure I picked it on the show before. I've been doing a lot of audiobook listening lately. I listen to a lot of podcasts too, but I set a limit to myself because I found myself buying books on Audible and then listening to podcasts. And so, and a lot of these books I wanted to read, and I just was like, okay, how do I prioritize this? So I've determined that for every 2 hours of audiobook listening, I can listen to one podcast episode. And the way that I'm doing this, I have a handful of shows that I listen to when they release, period. And so those don't count against that quota. But I have a lot of others that I'm kind of catching up on, or kind of not as, how do I put it? They're not as timely, and so I can catch up on them later and I don't miss out on a whole lot. And so those are the ones that I've been, pushing off. So I've really been enjoying that. The book I'm listening to right now is called The 5 Love Languages for Children. And the 5 Love Languages book is pretty well known, as far as, how you communicate your love to your romantic partner or to, other family members, adult family members. 5 Love Languages for Children is basically how you relate to your own children. or if you are, maybe you're in a position with nieces and nephews or whatever, and you want to deepen that relationship, you can use the techniques in the book to figure out how they understand love, and then, express it to them in the way that's most natural to them. And I've been really enjoying it. I have 5 kids, so that plays nicely there. It makes my life better, I guess I should say. But yeah, it's been a really terrific thing. And then another one is I've been finding that there are a bunch of backyard homesteader Facebook groups, and my yard has been a mess for years. And so we're finally, we basically hit the reset button. So we sprayed weed killer on the grass to kill the grass. And all of the weeds. Our lawn was basically 75% weeds, so we just killed it all. And anyway, these folks in the group, it's Utah Backyard Homesteaders is the one that I'm a member of. They have been terrific as far as what plant should I be looking at, what tree should I be looking at to plant. How do I get a lawn in? How do I need to be looking at this? And I've had a few neighbors come over and help too. One neighbor came over and spent like 20 minutes with me just pruning my trees in my yard. But yeah, it's just been really, really helpful to get that kind of feedback on my yard. So really been enjoying that. And then one last thing is I shouldn't say finally, I've been wanting to do this for a while, but I rebooted charlesmaxwood.com, and it's going to have like speaker information and things like that. But most of the programming content is still going to be on devchat.tv. And I think I'll probably put business stuff there too. I may start another blog for podcasting since I'm working on a podcasting system. charlesmaxwood.com is going to have my thoughts on other stuff. So if you don't like my political or religious views, probably not for you. But if you're interested in kind of how I think about things on other areas of life, I found that I just need an outlet for that. And I would love to have conversations with people, whether they agree with me or not, but I don't want to have arguments with people about it. So, if it's like, hey, you wrote this blog post about this, have you thought about this other thing? That's fun to just kind of dig into, well, what if this is true? What does that mean? What is, how does this all go together? Versus some of the other things that wind up happening where people start yelling at other people because they just don't get it. And yeah, I'm not so interested in those conversations. But anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. One last pick. My wife and I signed up for Sling TV, which is kind of a way to cut the cord. You get channels that you can stream to your TV. Turns out one of the primary engineers on Sling is my next door neighbor. He's also a former coworker of mine. But when we signed up, we got a Roku Express, and I've actually really been liking that. I've got it set up in my office. So if I want to watch a show, I can stream shows off of Sling or, any of the other ones. So your Netflix or Amazon Prime Video or anything like that. So if you're looking for a rather cheap streaming box, it's a nice way to go, and it works great. So anyway, those are my picks, and I went on for a long time. AJ, do you have some picks for us?
Okay, I've got one. So I finally, after like a year, quote, beat Breath of the Wild, which is not necessarily difficult to do because you can pretty much take on Ganon out of the gate if you really want to. You don't have to go through the whole story of the game. But I went through most of the story of the game, didn't complete too many of the side quests, maybe a couple dozen or so, and then got like 80 of the 120 shrines. Anyway, I decided to start over from scratch with my wife because she doesn't like video games, and I'm trying to convince her that this is a story that you play, so it's like reading a book. It's not an evil video game that sucks away your life and turns you into a loser. And it's just so magical all over again, and I'm so happy about it. So if you're not into Zelda, I don't know what's wrong with you, but you should fix it. See a doctor if you need to. And if you are, and you haven't played Breath of the Wild, I don't know what's wrong with you, but you need to fix that too. That's all.
Did it work with your wife?
It's kind of working. The way that she views it is that it's time that she gets to cuddle up to me, and I just stay still and let her cuddle up to me while I play. but she asked questions about the game, so I can tell that she's following the story. And she's like, well, wait, this was supposed to happen. When is this going to happen? So I feel like it's successful.
There you go. All right, Johannes, what are your picks?
Sure. My picks are a bit more technical, at least two of them. So something that we're super excited about as a company that has really changed the way how we're building products, how we think about marketing materials, about like anything visual really, we're now doing in Figma. So we've been using Sketch for a long while before then, and then as we brought on a new designer to our team who's been using Figma, we sort of adopted that as a whole company, and that's really been a game changer for us as we like collaborate on anything visual. So I can highly recommend that one. Also, it's free for people to get started with, so that's awesome. Something else that I think got announced a couple of months ago, but I haven't heard so much about it since then. But it's really just amazing to use. Are Netlify functions. So I guess that most of the listeners are familiar with Netlify as a way to host your static websites, React apps, etc. But they also support Lambda functions now, so you can basically just within your React app you can put in like some JavaScript code or Go code. And that will be deployed as Netlify automatically deploys that as Lambda functions for you. So that's an awesome way to build to build a bit of business logic around your applications. So I can highly recommend that one. And as a last pick, in a bit less than a month from now, in roughly 3 weeks, there will be the GraphQL Europe conference in Berlin. Where we have some really fantastic speakers, like the creators of GraphQL and various companies who are running GraphQL in production now for a couple of years, share their experiences. There will be some announcements around new technologies or new projects within the GraphQL ecosystem. So for anybody who's looking for an excuse to come out to Berlin, you can get tickets on graphqleurope.org.
Awesome. Now on the Netlify functions, are those hosted at Amazon or on Netlify?
Right. So right now Netlify supports Lambda functions. So it basically, for you under the hood, deploys them to Lambda. I think they're also working on support for Azure functions and various other providers. So they run on AWS right now.
Very cool. All right. Well, if people want to follow you online, see what you're working on these days, I'm assuming you're on Twitter and GitHub. Do you blog as well? Where is all that stuff?
I wish I would have the time to blog. I think my last blog post was like from 2014 or so. So that's not super up to date. But I'm fairly active on Twitter and also on GitHub. So Twitter, that's _Schickling. That's my last name. I guess you can find it in the show notes. I guess that's the best place to find me, or just in our community Slack. So we have a Slack with almost 10,000 Prisma users, and so you can also join there on like slack.prisma.io and just ping me there.
Very cool. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you for coming.
For sure. It was awesome to be here again.
All right. Well, we will catch everyone next week. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.